a powerful section. There's a lot of things happening at this point. We're going to be looking at it in this sense today as far as the gospel to Jethro and the nations. We've talked about this before, how the gospel, when we talk about the gospel, it's really a much bigger concept than how most of us have grown up talk about it, right? When we've been through Sunday school, we've been through vacation Bible school, we've been through all those things, and we usually limit the gospel. We talk about it just in the terms of the death, burial, and resurrection of Messiah. And of course, that's a pretty important moment, right? You all agree with that? That's a quintessential moment. It's the key to the whole thing. But the gospel, we need to understand that the gospel needs to be understood as the whole story of redemption. It's like from beginning to end, it's the work of God to restore a fallen humanity. Not just to save us, but to bring us into relationship with Him, to restore what was broken. Messiah was slain before the foundation of the world. And it started there with God. It started there with Him. And so the first picture of it, the first picture and glimpse of the gospel, that picture of redemption, happened all the way back in Genesis. With the clothing provided to Adam and Eve, those animal skins that covered over their nakedness, covered their sin. We see pictures of it again with the ark, which saved Noah and the living creatures through the waters. We see it all over the place in Genesis. He is telling the end from the beginning. He's doing those kinds of things. We see it with Abraham, with that promise that's given to him. We see that with the binding of Isaac. And on through the scriptures, all the way through to Revelation, the gospel of redemption is portrayed. And that is essential for us to understand, that the gospel is the big picture. It's the whole thing. And when we come to this text, when we come to this Torah portion, we see another important moment in it. One of the first people to start the process of redemption was Moses in sharing the gospel. We talk about the gospel to the nations. We talk about this because we see it in the Passover, we see it in the Exodus, we see it in this redemption from Egypt. Because built into that moment is the gospel, is a picture of it. Because the gospel was never just for the Jewish people. The gospel has always meant to be for the entire world. The gospel is always intended to include the Gentiles. That's one of the things that he talks about. We talk about the gospel to the nations in Isaiah 42. He says, "Thus says God, Adonai, who created the heavens and stretched them out, who spread out the earth and what comes from it, who gives breath to the people on it, and ruach to those who walk in it." He says, "I, Adonai, called you in righteousness. I will take hold of your hand. I will keep you and give you as a covenant to the people, as a light to the nations." That's always been the goal. That's always been the intention of things. He says it again. In Isaiah chapter 60, when we look at this covenant to the people, this light to the nations, he prophesied here in Isaiah 60 that all the nations would be drawn to Israel and to the God that they serve. He says, "Arise and shine, for your light has come. The glory of Adonai has risen on you. For behold, darkness covers the earth, and deep darkness the peoples. But Adonai will arise upon you, and His glory will appear over you." That's some of that language, again, of Passover. "But nations will come to your light, kings to the brilliance of your rising." That's the goal. As God does this in the Jewish people, it does this with the nations. It draws them in. By the time that Yeshua was born, this understanding of the Messiah, reaching out and the gospel, the good news of redemption, that the things going out to the nations, to the Gentiles, was pretty well established. We got that when Yeshua was even just 8 days old, when he was going into the temple, when he's presented. A man came up, a man named Simeon, and spoke to him in Luke chapter 2. He says, "So in the Ruach, Simeon came into the temple, and when the parents brought the child Yeshua to do for him according to the customs of the Torah, Simeon received him into his arms and offered a bracha, a blessing to God, saying, 'Now may you let your servant go in peace, O sovereign master, according to your word. For my eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared in the presence of all the peoples, a light for revelation to the nations, and the glory of your people, Israel.'" That's what it's for. That's what it's for. Paul, in talking about this gospel to the nations, he repeatedly spoke about his method of spreading the gospel on his missionary journeys was always going where first? He'd always go to the synagogues first. He would go to the Jew first and then to the Gentiles. That's here in Acts. He says both Paul and Barnabas spoke out boldly and said, it was necessary. It was necessary for the word of God to be spoken to you first. He's speaking to the Jewish people, speaking to the synagogues. But since you reject it and judge yourselves unfit for eternal life, behold, we turn to the Gentiles. We turn to the Gentiles. He goes on. Verse 47, "For so the Lord has commanded us, I have placed you as a light to the nations." That's the role that the nation of Israel was supposed to have. They were supposed to be this light to the nation, so that you may bring salvation to the ends of the earth. That's been the goal all along. It says when the Gentiles heard this, they were thrilled. And they glorified the word of the Lord, and as many as had been inscribed for eternal life, they believed. It was necessary. This was a necessary part of Paul's ministry and understanding of the gospel, the big picture, the story of redemption, God's eternal purposes. He says it in Acts chapter 26. He says, in describing his life and describing his ministry, he says, "Since I have had God's help to this day, I have stood here testifying to both small and great, and I am saying nothing but what the prophets and Moses said was going to happen." Everything that we think is new in the New Testament, everything that we think that is new in the life of what we call developing into Christianity, is something that the prophets and Moses said was going to happen. That the Messiah was to suffer, and that being first to rise from the dead, he would proclaim light both to our people and to the nations. It's always been understood that way. And Paul, he became known as the apostle to the Gentiles. But really, he was not the first one to do it. He wasn't the first one to tell the gospel, tell the story of redemption to the Gentiles. He was only following Yeshua's example. Yeshua had already done it multiple times in the Gospels. And we see it when he's talking with a Samaritan woman in John chapter 4. She was not of the nation, but she heard it, received it, and accepted it, and her whole community was changed. We see it when he goes and he speaks to the Syrophoenician woman in Mark chapter 7. He goes and shares with her. He speaks to the Roman centurion. He, over and over again, he's reaching out beyond what they thought he should in order to open their heart and their mind to the redemption of God. One of the first ones to tell the gospel to a non-Jewish person was Moses in this section. Because the portion opens with a statement that I believe is a summary of what's going to happen, what happens following. In Exodus chapter 18, it says, "Now Jethro, the priest of Midian and Moses' father-in-law," so was he, Is he a Jewish person? Is he of the descendant of the nations? Is he one of the tribes? He's a Midianite. He's related, but he's not a descendant through the promise, right? He heard about everything God had done for Moses and for his people Israel, and how Adonai brought Israel out of Egypt. Okay, that's what he had heard. And the account that follows is really an explanation of how Jethro learned all this stuff, learned these events. And in reading it again last night, it's more and more we've been looking at it, I'm more convinced that chapter 18 is actually not in chronological order. This is one of those examples of where the Bible's not always written in chronological order. Y'all realize that, right? That sometimes makes it hard and sometimes confusing. But I'm more and more convinced that chapter 18 actually happens after chapter 19 and 20 at least. And I say that for a couple of reasons. In 19, they are going to set up the camp so Moses can then go up to Mount Sinai to receive the Torah from God. We see that in chapter 19, verse 1. It says, in the 3rd month after Bnei Israel had gone out of the land of Egypt, that same day they arrived in the wilderness of Sinai. And this is, they left about on the 15th day, right, of the 1st month. And so the 2nd month has passed, so 15 days is about halfway through the month. The 2nd month is about another 30 days, so they've got about 45 days. And then when Moses goes up to the mountain and receives the Torah, how many days is that? Talked about this earlier. It happens on the day of Shavuot, the day of Pentecost. So about 50 days after they leave Egypt, in the 3rd month. That's how they come to understand that. They arrived in the wilderness of Sinai. They traveled from Rephidim, came into the wilderness of Sinai, and they have set up camp in the wilderness. Israel camped there right in front of the mountain. But when you look at it in chapter 18, Jethro comes, as we were reading about, he comes and visits them, and the Israelites are already encamped. All right? It says Jethro's father-in-law had heard all these things about what was going on. Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, came with his sons and his wife to Moses into the wilderness where he was encamped at the mountain of God. All right? And so they already seem to be encamped. They're already there when Jethro arrives. And it seems like they've already developed this routine of the camp. They've only been there about 45 to 50 days or so. They've already developed this routine in the camp of them coming to Moses whenever there's a conflict. There's a day set aside that Moses is going to sit up, and you can come and bring your issue for Moses to decide the case. The next day Moses sat to judge the people, and they stood. So everybody knew this was going to happen. They lined up early in the morning to try to be the first ones in line. They stood around Moses from how long? Morning till evening. Was there a lot of business to conduct? Yes, for that many millions of people, there was a lot of issues to deal with, and it took all day to get it done. Moses answered his father-in-law, it's because the people come to me to inquire of God. When they have an issue, it comes to me, and I judge between a man and his neighbor. All right? This has been going on long enough that people know if you want to get your case heard, you'd better get there early. You better be prepared for that. It's long enough that people are starting to get frustrated, and that Moses is starting to get worn out from all of the effort. And it's starting to get dark. So we might want to turn on the light. I don't know what it is. There we go. But Moses is starting to get worn out. What's that?
3 million people.
With 3 million problems? Yeah. Yeah. Because this obviously was an all-day affair. there was a line of people, there were cases and issues. Some would take longer than others. Can you imagine having to stand there and wait to get your issue dealt with? And this was a longer line than the line that you have at the DMV when you need to go in and get your license renewed, and that person's just, you pick a number and you have no idea when your number is going to get called, and you're just sitting there waiting. Can you imagine being there all day, and then they say, okay, we're closed, we're done for the day, and you're like, but wait a minute, I haven't been called yet. Well, you'll have to come back tomorrow and get a new number. How would y'all like that?
Days and days and days.
And for and by the way, we're not going to be open tomorrow. It's going to be next week before you can come back and do this.
Yeah.
That would get frustrating really fast. And so this is where Jethro comes along. What you're doing is not good. You'll surely wear yourself out, as well as these people who are with you, because the task is too heavy for you. You can't do it alone and by yourself. Right? So if you do this thing as God has commanded you, then you will be able to endure, and all these people will go to their places in shalom. Jethro is trying to solve a problem that's been existing in this people. That's another reason why I think it's happening after 19 and 20. And of course, the last reason why I think that why this is happening after, chapter 18 is after, is because Moses is already familiar with God's statutes and his laws. When you look at 16b, it says, I make them understand God's statutes and his laws. So he's been hearing them, he's been getting them, it's like he's received them already. God's statutes is the word chok, and his law is Torot, right? He knows them enough to teach them. He knows them enough to try to pass them along. And then there are the 10 Commandments of chapter 20. There are all those cases and situations in chapter 21 and such that seem to be listed in all that greater detail. And so, Moses is saying this, and Jethro's saying, well, okay, you've got all that. Enlighten them as to the statutes and the laws, and show them the way by which they must walk and the work that they must do. So it seems like they've already have received all of this instruction already. And of course, this brings up an interesting thing that we talked about last night, something to consider. And we've talked about this before, and that's Moses' 2 sons that Jethro brings with him. To my knowledge, this is like the last time they're mentioned. They're not really brought up again, to my knowledge. Now, you can fix me on that if you need to, but we'd asked what happened to them. Why don't we really hear anything from their lives? And if this reasoning is correct, and chronologically, chapter 18, when Jethro shows up, is actually after chapter 19. That means that Moses' boys weren't there at the giving of the Torah. They weren't there at the establishment of the covenant being cut. And that might create an issue. I'll talk about it a little bit later. But back in chapter 18, verse 1, Jethro comes. He's finding out what's been going on. And it wouldn't have surprised me if he already had some knowledge of something. He's probably heard something going on. When Moses, he had sent his wife back home with his 2 boys. It talks about that in there. He sent Zipporah and her boys back. And she may have already seen some of the judgments, some of the plagues that had come upon Egypt. And maybe Jethro had heard about some of the rumors coming out of Egypt, the traders and from the people fleeing Egypt while they could. And because remember, the process of the plagues took place over the course of probably at least a year, or maybe more. So, but rumor could not put the whole picture together. If he heard bits and pieces, rumor couldn't explain why all of this stuff was happening. Rumor could not explain who was responsible for what was happening. And so that's why Jethro, this Midianite, not a part of the tribes, This non-Jewish man needed someone to tell him the story. We see that back in chapter 18. This is Moses sharing essentially what is the gospel, the redemption, with Jethro. So Moses told his father-in-law all that Adonai had done to Pharaoh and to the Egyptians for Israel's sake. He's telling him the who and the why and what for, as well as the travail that had come upon them along the way and how Adonai had delivered them. Moses was being a light to a Gentile for all practical purposes. He was sharing the gospel with someone from the nations who didn't come out of Egypt with them, or not even as a part of the mixed multitude. Jethro wasn't a part of either of those things. And so once Moses shared the gospel, shared the good news of redemption from Egypt with Jethro, what's his reaction? Jethro rejoiced. Just like the Gentiles did in the book of Acts, when Paul was saying, hey, I took it to you first, you rejected it, so that's why I'm going to them. And they're like, great! We get to hear this. We get to receive this. We get to be a part of this. And Jethro rejoices for all the goodness that Adonai had shown to Israel since he had delivered them out of the hand of the Egyptians. So he is receiving the good news with joy. And then he's coupling it with belief. And he couples it again with sitting down to join them in covenant meal. That's what happens next. Jethro says, blessed be Adonai, who has delivered you out of the hand of the Egyptians and out of the hand of Pharaoh, and has delivered the people from under the hand of the Egyptians. This is him saying, that makes sense. I see what he has done. I believe. Blessed are you, Adonai. All right, but then he goes on. He says, now I know that Adonai is greater than all the gods, since they had acted arrogantly against him. This is a statement of faith from Jethro, a statement of belief. Then look what he does. Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, presented a burnt offering and sacrifices to God. Aaron also came along with all the elders of Israel to eat bread with Moses' father-in-law. Where? They were doing it all before God. They were doing it all before God. This is how it's supposed to work. Right? Jethro became a part of the covenant community because the gospel, the good news of redemption, went to the Jew first, and then they took it to the nation. They believed and then became a part of what God was doing. As Moses and the Israelites follow God in faithfulness, they act as a light to the Gentile, and the Gentiles then is drawn to the nation and to the mountain of God's kingdom and to his Torah and to his way of life. Jethro's words and his actions exemplify what's supposed to happen today in our world. What's supposed to have happened all the way back then when Yeshua was there, when the apostles were sent forth. It reflects what happens supposed to happen in Psalm 86, where we come to understand that there is none like you among the gods, my Lord. There are no deeds like yours. Jethro said almost that exact same thing. He says, all nations you have made will come and bow down before you, my Lord, and they will glorify your name. For you are great and do wonders. You alone are God. He's describing all the miracles and the wonders and things that God done. Just like Moses explained the wonders of God to Jethro about how they were delivered from Egypt. Then he says this, teach me. That's the natural progression. Once you come to believe, once you come to understand all of this, then you're ready to say this, teach me your way, Adonai, that I may walk in your truth. Give me an undivided heart to fear your name.
Discipleship.
That's discipleship. You're ready to be a disciple. You know, what starts as belief in him for his wonders turns into a call for a new way of life. The good news of his wonders, what he has done to redeem us, then draws us to him and his reign, his kingship. He frees us from our slavery, and He shows us the life of the kingdom at the mountain. And at the heart of all of that is His Torah. Both here at Mount Sinai and that future Messianic kingdom. That's what we were singing about in that song, Come Let's Go Up to the Mountain, Isaiah chapter 2. It will come to pass in the last days. So he's talking about the last days. Are these days that have happened yet in Isaiah's day? Isaiah's well after the Exodus, so he can't be talking about Mount Sinai, because he's talking about something that hasn't come yet. So it's future. He says, in the last days that the mountain of Adonai's house will stand firm as head of the mountains and will be exalted above the hills. And so all nations will flow to it. It says, then many peoples, not just one people, not just one nation, but many peoples, many ethnic groups, many nations will go and say, come, let us go up to the mountain of Adonai, to the house of the God of Jacob. Right? So they're acknowledging that, hey, this is the God of Jacob. We're going to where His place is. It's not been our place before, but we're going there to the God of Jacob. It says, then He will do what? He will teach us His ways, and we will walk in His paths. For Torah will go forth from Zion, and the word of Adonai from Jerusalem. All nations, all peoples, in the future, in those last days, are going to be coming to Him at His mountain, and where we are supposed to be hearing His word, where we're supposed to be taught His ways, and where we agree to live by them. That's the essential part of it. We are agreeing to live by them. So even the nations, all people are invited to hear and be taught the ways of His Torah and live by them. So in coming to the mountain, we hear the covenant of God, the terms of what is essentially that marriage contract. And so if they come to the mountain, if they accept the terms to be taught His ways, and they agree to walk in His paths, or in His halakha, then they become His treasured possession. That's in chapter 19. As Moses is up there on the mountain, as Moses is speaking with the Lord, this is what he says. Then, if you listen closely to my voice, if you keep my covenant, then you will be my own treasure from among all people, for all the earth is mine. And so as for you, you will be to me a kingdom of Kohanim, of priests, and a holy nation. These are the words which you are to speak to Bnei Israel. So, that's the question. If you want to be His treasured possession, you demonstrate your love, you demonstrate your acceptance, you demonstrate that that's what you want in your life by doing what? Listening to His voice, and you keep His covenant. Basically, essentially, you are accepting His proposal of marriage. And that's where I wonder, this is speculation on my part, but I wonder about Moses' boys. When Jethro sits down to the meal, did they participate or not? I don't know. It doesn't say that for sure. Did they choose to sit down and break bread with Moses before the Lord as Jethro did? I don't know. But Moses, look at chapter 19, verse 7. So Moses went. He called for the elders of the people, and he put before them all these words that Adonai had commanded him. And all the people answered together and said, what? Everything that Adonai has spoken, we will do. And then Moses reported the words of the people to Adonai. So if God is coming and saying, here is a marriage contract, I am proposing marriage to you, what's their answer?
Do I do everything?
Yes, I do. That's their answer. They are accepting those terms. They are accepting the marriage. They said yes. And it's only then are we truly becoming or accepting the bridegroom. Are we accepting the Messiah? You know, in modern terms, we talk about it like this. You hear this, and I've heard it most of my life, where we say, you say that Jesus is your Savior, but is He really your Lord? Y'all heard that discussion before? The whole Lordship discussion? Yes, you can be saved, but is He your Lord? That's one way we've talked about it. The Israelites were in much the same position. They had been saved, they had been redeemed and delivered from Egypt, but here is where they are deciding to truly accept Him as their Lord. They could have walked away at this point. Yeah, they were saved. Yeah, they were redeemed from Egypt. They didn't have to do this, right? This is where counting the cost of discipleship really comes in. You know, yes, you want to be saved, but do you truly want to live as a disciple? And most of us probably can look back at our lives. We've been in a similar timeline in salvation, you know, that something drew us to make a confession of faith. Something drew us or made us want to get baptized, to accept Jesus as our Savior. You know, that may have happened when you were young. You know, when you didn't really understand everything, what you were getting yourself into. You know, mom and dad, you know, they wanted you to, or your friends really wanted you to, so you did. You know, and you're saved, and you're delivered, much like the Israelites coming out of Egypt. You're saved as though through fire, so to speak. But you're also like Jethro when he hears the gospel. You know, the good news of redemption of God. You confess His name. You believe, make that statement of faith. Now I know that Adonai is Lord and there is no one else like Him. But at some point, you've also got to come to the mountain and agree that God is going to be your God, that He's going to be your Lord, to become this disciple, one who is pursuing the life of the Master. Because at some point, you've got to sit down and eat the covenant meal, like Jethro did. That is the counting of the cost of discipleship. Because this will make all the difference in your walk with God. It will make all the difference in your effectiveness and your fruitfulness for His kingdom. See, because the mountain, Mount Sinai here in this Torah portion, is where the Torah is laid out. You know, the Torah defines, the Torah of God defines how a disciple is supposed to live. The Torah is what essentially the husband expects of his bride, and it also lays out what the husband's obligations to his bride are. Because Yeshua, did He have a different standard? Or did He have the same definition of what He expects of His bride?
He had a higher standard.
He had the same to a higher standard for us, because He had the same definition for His own walk as a bridegroom, because He kept the Torah perfectly, and He didn't come to abolish it, as we've talked about. He didn't come to do away with it, but to fully preach it, to uphold it, to live it, to walk it out as the bridegroom. He was not at fault in the terms of the marriage. So this Torah came at Mount Sinai, and again, that goes back to, you know, it's been 50 days since they've left Egypt. This Torah came on Mount Sinai on the same day as the Holy Spirit, the Feast of Weeks, Shavuot, what we call Pentecost. So the Holy Spirit, which came to change our hearts from stone to flesh, which we read about in Ezekiel, to write the Torah on our new heart and to give us the power and even the desire to walk in it. That's what being a disciple is. That's when we become a disciple. And you know, maybe you're in that position here. You know, like the Israelites, you're delivered, but you haven't really gone to the mountain. You're saved, but He's not yet Lord. You haven't committed to this way of life as an entire lifelong process. And at some point, you need to make a decision to come to the mountain, to sit down at the covenant meal. You know, I remember my own getting saved at about 11 or 12 years old. But it wasn't until I turned about 18 that I really started to take my faith seriously, that I committed to His Word, that I committed to living for Him. There was a time between my redemption and my lordship. There was a time between Israel's redemption and the lordship of God. And it's been almost 30 years since then. And guess what? I'm still coming to understand what all that really means. I'm still growing and learning what it means to be a disciple of God. I'm learning from studying His Word. And so if anybody still has questions about that, if you have a decision to make regarding that lordship idea, we can always talk about it. That's okay. We can have those kind of questions, and I want to encourage you to take the next step, to sit down at the meal, so to speak, to choose to receive Him as the bridegroom. Because we are redeemed, we are saved, and then we are brought to the mountain. The mountain, the Torah, is given to those who have already been redeemed. That's an important distinction. We're always accused of, oh, you're keeping the Torah. You are interested in the Torah because you're trying to be saved. It was never that way. The Torah is only for a redeemed people. Everyone who has been redeemed, whether you are Israel, whether you are the mixed multitude, whether you're Jethro, whether you're a Jew or Gentile, at some point you're going to be brought to the mountain, to the authority of Adonai, and you're supposed to hear and you're supposed to agree to live by the terms of the ketubah, the marriage contract. The Torah, you're supposed to agree to enter into that covenant with Him. Everybody, all the redeemed are supposed to come to that point. And we saw that Jethro did that. He heard, he believed, and he knew that Adonai was greater than all the other gods. And then he presented this burnt offering and this sacrifice. So those already had to be in operation. And then he sat down to break bread. That's what we looked at. I know that Adonai is greater. Then he sits down to the meal. That's the process. That's the gospel. That's our lives. But now do you see a problem? Do you see a danger with the theology that says, oh, the Torah, that's done away with. That's abolished. That's not for this age of grace, as you sometimes hear about. Do you see a problem with a theology that teaches that we as believers in Yeshua have no relationship, no obligation, no sense of Torah? That's basically saying, right? That's basically saying that we are satisfied, that it's, anyway, enough. It's enough. It's sufficient with being delivered from Egypt and stopping right there. I mean, is that a big deal? Is being delivered from Egypt a big deal? Absolutely. I mean, that's essential. But by saying that we have no relationship to Torah, we're basically saying that we're happy being delivered, but we don't need to go to the mountain of God. We don't need to receive the Torah. And in saying that, you are rejecting God's desire to make you His treasured possession. You are rejecting His call to make you a citizen, a member of the kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Because those special things, that status only happens when you come to the mountain and agree to make Him Lord. When you agree to listen closely to His voice, to keep His covenant, and to walk in His ways. That doesn't change your status as someone who's saved or as someone who is redeemed, but it does change your status as someone who is useful to Him in His kingdom. It does change that status as that treasured possession or as a holy person. And before we start down, because I know what's probably going through some of your minds, is before we start down that old program path that was for them, that's not for us, right? That was the Jews, that's not us. That's the old way, we're in the new way. Understand that this same call is for the redeemed, is made after the resurrection. 1 Peter. But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for God's own possession. Same language. so that you may proclaim the praises of the one who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. There is a purpose for being a chosen people, the priesthood, the people belonging to God, so that you can be useful to him. You can really be effective in your life of proclaiming his wonders. Because when you're proclaiming his wonders, what are you doing? You're sharing the gospel. You're sharing the gospel with those who think they know it but really don't. Or might have heard a few things here and there, but have never really had the story laid out of how he has redeemed us out of darkness and into his marvelous light. See, this statement was made in the context and understanding of what happened in the Exodus at Passover, the redemption of Israel from Egypt. Now, this is 1 Peter chapter 2. Go back to 1 Peter, whoops. That should be chapter 1, I believe. He says, 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 18, says, "You know that you were redeemed from the futile way of life handed down from your ancestors, not with perishable things such as silver or gold, but with precious blood like that of a lamb, without defect or spot, the blood of Messiah." Isn't that language of Passover? So Peter has already brought them to the mountain. He's bringing them to the Exodus. He's bringing them to understand what he's saying in that context. And he goes on, he says, "He was chosen before the foundation of the world, but was revealed in these last times for your sake." It's through him you are believers in God, who raised him from the dead and gave him glory, so that your trust and your hope are in God. The Exodus, the redemption, all of that is part of that call to being the holy nation. The call to be God's chosen people, his royal priesthood, his holy nation, to be his treasured possession. For Peter, must be understood as coming to the mountain where the Torah goes forth. To Pentecost, when the Torah is written where? Not on tablets of stone, but where? Right here, on our hearts. That is the whole gospel process that we see happening in the life of Jethro, where we see him being told the gospel, he believes the gospel, he accepts the lordship by participating in the covenant meal. And I was thinking about this. I'll just kind of finish with this. You think about the gospel progression of how things happen and how it keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. You know, the first thing started with one guy, one man, right? One man, Abraham, right? He answered that call of God, this redemption process. He answered the call of God and was promised what? Land and children, right? So this one man grew into this family. And from this one man, you know, he has these, eventually he has this one man's children. All families of the earth are supposed to be blessed. And through this one man's descendants, the Messiah would come through these Abraham's children. And this family would then grow into something much even bigger than that, an entire people. They would grow into something bigger. The gospel would grow. These 12 tribes of people numbering in the millions by the time they leave Egypt. And so from this one man came this larger family, which grows into this considerable people, which God says, that's not big enough, because I want to take more than just my people out of Egypt with me. So then he takes them to Mount Sinai in order to build a powerful kingdom. That's the progression of the gospel. It is to this kingdom that all the kingdoms of the earth are supposed to flow to it, to be drawn to it. As all nations would bring their abundance, because then the true king, the Messiah, who was promised all the way from starting with him, the true king over all the earth will be sitting on his throne in power. That's the whole gospel. The entire mechanism, or the whole issue of redeeming us from our fallen state and bringing us into this kingdom so that we may truly be in relationship with Him, truly be His citizens of His kingdom, restored to the state that we were always supposed to be in with Him.